Welcome back. This is your host, Siris King. It feels like a million years since I did a YouTube video. Probably was. I think. I didn't check, but I think last time I did a video was like 9 months ago. Time is flying. And I got a really good response to my ATR videos. And I feel, I mostly do podcasting on MMA and sci fi. So I don't really have time for YouTube as much or this channel. But I always feel like sometimes if I get inspired, let me just come back and drop a video or two real quick. And today that's what I'm going to do. And I like the fact that my previous ATR videos have got a really good response and people liked it, and it's good to see. It's refreshing to see because I feel that really out of all types of spirituality, I mean, don't get me wrong, Aborigines, which is in Australia, might come close. Um, you might even get certain parts of South America that may be isolated as well. But those are only two places, Australia and certain parts of South America. You would have to be going to like Paraguay or parts of South America, or even Bolivia, parts of South America that even Latin Americans barely know outside that region, right? Those are only two places that could compete, in my opinion, in terms of not in terms of who's best, but in terms of who is most isolated. Meaning, the big problem with ATRs, or that's short for African traditional religions, is that most people would take from, like, when they deal with spirituality, they'll take spirituality from any other part of the world. But once you get to Africa, and when I'm talking about Africa, I'm not even saying Egypt. I'm talking about the real Africa. Once you start to go to the real South, right? They're like they get scared, or they just it's either two things. They either get scared, or they look down on it and think it's primitive. So either way, what ends up happening is that you have the place that really has the oldest spiritual system, and the place that, in a lot of ways, because of that lack of respect, that's part of the reason why humanity is at a place it is right now. And I can't change that, but I could do my best to, at least for certain individuals who are sincere on the sincere path, to push them in that direction where they could look at Africa with a new perspective, new lens. And if they look at it from a new lens, then that could actually cross over into their native spiritual systems, and or even their native spiritual journeys, their individual spiritual journeys as well. So that's all I hope to do with the ATR series in that sense, and that's why I like the fact that it got such a really good response, and kind of motivated me to continue it when I have the time. So in this video, I kind of want to talk about how someone who's truly practicing an African traditional religion, and when I'm saying that truly, I mean they're just not practicing their spiritual system. I don't even like to say the word religion, really. Spiritual system is a way of life, right? They're not just practicing that system. Their mind is transformed by that system. And literally what ends up, because when you look at most people who practice those systems today, especially when you look at the transported versions of those systems in the diaspora, which is in the Americas, when it came from the slave trade, and I keep saying especially, but definitely when you start to go up to North America. I think when you look at it in South America and to some extent the Caribbean, it may be transformed for those regions, but it's still African in that sense, right? Even if they come in and fusing it with Catholicism, because I mean, at the end of the day, Catholicism is offshoot of Egyptian spirituality, which is African too, right? It's not the Africa I'm focusing on, right? With ATRs, like that's what I really want to distinguish myself between some people who practice African spiritual systems. Like you have some people who practice African spiritual systems, but they still have that same problem, where the more south you go, I'm not gonna say the darker it gets, but you could look at it like that. And I don't just mean darker skin. I mean gets more African, it gets more earth element, it gets more grounded, right? So for some people, they try to cure this by making almost like taking a side step, like a side journey, where they will say, okay, I'm gonna go to Africa, I'm gonna go to Tip, Egypt, and I will have to admit that's enough to pass. So like if I'm grading it, I'll give you a D if you're doing that, right? And that's a lot. That's a lot more than most. Like 70% of the non-Africans. And when I'm talking about non-Africans, I'm just not even saying. I don't see. That's the thing with African traditional spiritual systems, right? When you have the mindset, we just look at things differently, right? So humanity is African. Let's keep it real. Humanity is African. So when I'm saying non-Africans, I'm talking about from the standpoint of people who have stepped away from that mind. And a lot of times, a lot of modern Africans have stepped away from that mindset too. The only difference they have is that because they still live in that region, it's only so far they can step away. That's the big difference. So even if you're an African transported to the Americas, unless you actually make an effort, and again, you can't just do you can't do the Egypt, right? Like I said, you might get a D, and I'm being nice, right? Everything besides Egypt that's non-African, because Egypt's still African, but like when you start going into Iraq with Anunnaki information, or you start even to go into the Hebrew Israelite information, or you start even going to the Islamic information. From the standpoint of the African traditional religion, or that the true African mind, yeah, you don't even get a D. You get an F, straight up. And I'm going to talk about why that a little bit in this video, but I'm going to have a video dedicated totally to that, right? I don't want to focus on that. In this video, I want to kind of focus on Atlantis and the aliens and kind of what more people will label New Age. But naturally, what ends up happening is that when I talk about Africans, humanity is African. So if you are a non-black person but understands this concept, and you get back into that type of spirituality, you're still African. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the people, black or white, who definitely don't live in Africa, because like I said, the difference with Africans is that they still live in the region, but who don't live in Africa, who walk away from it. And again, when I'm talking about it from the spiritual aspect, if you want to get into science and mathematics and other stuff, that's different. But we talk about spiritually. Yeah, when you walk away from it, your spiritual system will diminish. There's no question. And the spiritual systems that haven't diminished would be probably systems that are more solar based, like some aspects of Kabbalah, Gnosticism, some aspects of Sufism. So that's a little bit different. I might talk about that in a video in the future. I don't know, because the lunar versus solar a lot of times gets kind of confusing to people, and it feels, some people interpret it as like if I'm explaining solar and lunar, I'm saying one is higher, right? So most people, they would say which one's more powerful. I would say solar, so they would say, oh, I'm attacking lunar, and that's not the case. In fact, when you talk about a lunar-based spiritual system, it's really talking about integrating into your environment. So because it's talking about integrating into your environment, you kind of have to deal with that system before you do any solar-based system. That's traditionally why, when you start talking about going to the continent and you start talking about practicing the spirituality of the continent, they have a totally different look on things than most other spiritual systems would when it even comes down to things like Atlantis and aliens, right? So let's go straight to it. If you say, well, Atlantis, Lemuria, the times of myth, the first thing somebody who's practicing an African traditional spiritual system would say is this: if you have access to the oral stories, yes, Atlantis, Lemuria probably existed. Now, here's the thing. In the West, because a lot of people have not really tapped into their African mindset, they do either two things, right? You're going to have the person who, and I'm really going to come at it from the first angle, the person who becomes extremely logical, right? And when they become extremely logical, if I say Atlantis, Lemuria, not only does that sound New Age, they would say you can't prove it. Now, is there something wrong with that mindset? No, it's not. Because if I was going into a history circle, like if I'm talking about like history buffs, and I'm talking about it from that aspect, I would not talk about Atlantis, Lemuria, because not only can you not prove it, because think of it, if you can't prove something, it usually means, especially when it comes to history, that region is not affecting modern history, right? So if I can't prove Atlantis, Lemuria, then even if you're a person who thinks Atlantis, Lemuria is real, and I'm talking about from the history angle, it's not affecting history. So to mention it doesn't make any sense. If you want to talk about something that's affecting history, you probably start in Mesopotamia, you probably start in Egypt, you probably start even in Roman Greece, right? You're talking about things that are affecting current history. So you get the first branch, and this is usually people who are dealing with Egyptian spirituality, or Kemetic spirituality as they call it in America, who they would say Atlantis, Lemuria doesn't exist, and they would be very condescending about it. They would be just as condescending to that as a so-called non-African would be condescending about maybe African spiritual systems, right? They don't see that they're doing the same thing. And again, they don't know how to differentiate between history and spirituality. When you talk about history, you probably wouldn't talk about Atlantis and Lemuria. You probably say it doesn't exist. If you talk about science, right? If coming from the scientific angle, you probably wouldn't care either because obviously we're not practicing the science of Atlantis and Lemuria. So our science right now cannot understand the science they practice. So if you're coming from the scientific angle, you might be say, well, you can't prove you can't prove they existed. You can't disprove it either. So because they're not really our science right now can't understand the stuff they were tapping into, you probably wouldn't focus on them either, right? Now, if you really pay attention to what I'm saying, that's a big difference. Like if you just say, well, from the scientific angle, we can't produce the science they were using at that time. So let's start with sciences that we can produce, like and that will go back to the more recent empires: Nubia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Mayans, etc., right? You're gonna go even more modern, the Greeks, the Romans, right? So let's go into something that's more modern, something that is similar to the sciences that we're practicing now. That's what. So if you come from the scientific angle, you take that angle or that aspect. Then if you're coming from the history angle, you would say, well, there's a reason why we call them mythological empires because they're not affecting our current trajectory of history. So from those two angles, you wouldn't deal with Atlantis and Lemuria, and that's fine. And even when you deal with somebody who's dealing with African traditional religions, they would say the same thing. In fact, they would say, yes, Atlantis and Lemuria existed, but Africa is the origin of life, and that means Africa existed right when Atlantis and Lemuria existed. And the biggest difference is Atlantis and Lemuria is not here anymore. Africa is. So when you're coming from the mindset of the African traditional religions, that's the mindset you have. It sounds deep, sounds complicated. It's not. Because then they will say, well, if the other two sides are gone and we're still here, that means we have something to offer the world. And if you really pay attention to what that means, though, and this is where a lot of people in the Americas who practice what I call a reactive type of African mindset don't understand. The people in the Americas who practice the reactive, so like the first group where I said, like, let's say they would say they'll be too logical, right? They'll be overly logical and they would dismiss it. Then you get the other group who would then use this as a reason to be now condescending towards other spiritual systems, right? So they would say, well, Africa's the first, so I'm going to just practice that, and I don't need to practice the younger systems. That's something that's a huge mistake as well, because a lot of times what ends up happening is when you see younger systems, this is why when you look at really the versions of African spiritual systems in Americas, but especially in North America, really in North America, the problem that happens is that there's no evolution. So, they would say things like, oh, well, we didn't draw circles. We didn't use magic mirrors. We didn't use crosses, right? Even though even that one is like, Africa is a big place. There's many different tribes. You really can't talk, right? For every tribe. That's the problem, too. Like, we act like it's a country. It's a place of thousands of tribes. In fact, not only is it a place of thousands of tribes, it's probably the origin of every single race, even their current incarnations. When you start to think of places like Madagascar and some of the other islands close to it, right, where you see Indian populations, right, who some people say were indigenous to the region. So you got what you call Indians, right, who indigenous to Africa. You got the Berbers, I probably pronouncing that wrong, in North Africa, right? You talk about Libya, Algeria, who are Caucasian. They're indigenous to Africa, right? So you have, in a sense, and then that's not even counting the South African Bushmen or the Sand people, who were the first people on Earth. Or then you could go into the Pygmies, right, which are probably the second people on Earth. So the Sands and the Pygmies are the two oldest tribes. Or the Pygmies don't like their name, or you could say Baka, right? The two oldest tribes. And their spiritual system from those two tribes influenced all African spiritual systems. A lot of the counterparts in Americas in general, to be fair, not just North America, in Americas in general, but it's worse in North America, don't know that the Sands and the Pygmies were the first two, right? So they are the mothers and fathers of every African spiritual system. Then when you want to talk about the third group that came in, talk about the East African groups. Some people, like the Nubians, people from like who predate the Egyptians, right? Ethiopians, you talk about that group. So they came third. And then, you get the tricky things too, because then you even have the Ashanesian groups, who I don't know when they came in. I don't know if they came in before the Nubians, but I do know they're the first people to leave Africa, right? So the Ashanesian groups, eventually became the modern Aborigines, Melanesians, um, indigenous Filipinos, right? Indigenous Thais. When they left, they were the first group to leave. So when they left Africa, they evolved so differently that then eventually other races came through them. So you basically have you basically talking about when we talk about when a lot of people in America are talking about African traditional religions, they usually tend to talk about the religions that are coming from the tribes or cultures that came from the slave trade, right? So they're talking about the people who come from them. So you talking about heavy voodoo, palo, obia, hoodoo, right? Uh, Santeria, Ifa, things like that, right? And what happens is that tends to be west or central, but you got the south, you got the east, you got the north, and even within the west and central, there's other tribes that didn't really get captured, so you don't really see as much aspects of their spirituality in the African spiritual systems in Americas. So that's a big problem in that sense because it gives you a biased point of view, and then it makes you do things like talk for the whole continent, and you can't talk for the continent. No one can really, honestly, because the continent. Remember, Africa. If you were to put what is it, India, China, North America, Western Europe, and Mexico together, it's not even bigger than Africa. It's a huge place of different peoples. So you really can't talk for the whole continent when it comes to spirituality because every tribe didn't agree on certain things. What the tribes usually did was that there's some things they all agree on, right? So they always tended to focus on the things they all agree on. So, for instance, when it comes to the concept of Atlantis and Lemuria, even if you get a tribe that because they may not use those words in terms of like Atlantis and Lemuria is still kind of Western terms. They may not use those words. Like if you talk about Lemuria, you're talking about people who are related to, or people or even spirituality that's more related to the Madagascar group in Africa, right? So you talk about islands that's off East Africa. You're talking about spirituality that's related to those people, right? When you talk about Atlantis, you're talking about spirituality that, and this is why I made a video a long time ago when I was even talking about the concept of Atlantis. I said in that video, if you approach Atlantis as a real place, that is not how you should approach Atlantis, because when you're dependent on your physical senses and the historical information that you have, you can't prove it. Now, note, I'm still taking even though it seems the same, I'm still taking a different approach than the person who would just say it didn't exist. And especially when you're practicing what they call comedic information and you say that doesn't exist, right? It sounds the same, it's a different approach because I'm saying, in the end, it's not the best approach to try to use Atlantis as a historical reference. It's probably not even the best approach, and this is where I think the people who are practicing African spiritual systems have an edge. It's not even probably a good example to say use that as your spiritual like anchor, right? To start talking about, well, I'm practicing Atlantean spirituality. You shouldn't do that either, because if you're dependent on information that you can only get with your physical senses, your experience has not taught you that Atlantis exists. But you can use Atlantis for this example. Use Atlantis to say, wow, what if we had a civilization where alchemy was taught in schools? Where instead of calling magic, we call it science. Instead of people using the material aspects of religion, the material aspects of religions, we talk about the Urgi and Kabbalah, and they learn that from when they're young. You do that, your whole society changes. Your whole society changes. The whole world changes. And then when the whole world changes, that's like a utopia that you say is Atlantean type. And then that becomes a symbol of what Atlantis could be. When they made America and some of the Masons used to say we're going to make the new Atlantis, that is the way to approach it. Because if you're dependent on your physical senses only and information that you're getting from books, you don't know if it existed or not. But now this is the messed up part. People will flock to that. But as the Africans would say, our spiritual systems were around even when Atlantis and Lemurians were around. So, and in fact, we survived and they didn't. So then it flips it and say, well, and so that's why then someone who's practicing African traditional religion would say, you need to give us respect and you need to maybe take a look. And unfortunately, when people practice a reactive type of spirituality, right? And again, Africa is a big place, many tribes. You get certain people who wouldn't agree on certain things. You got some people who would say, listen, like they're very hesitant to teach non-Africans, right, in terms of visually, right, because of the history of what happened. Even though humanity's from Africa, the younger tribes have come in and you know, kind of helped mess up the continent. Now, I'm not saying that people who live in the continent can't take responsibility either, but definitely it's been taken advantage of by certain some of the younger tribes who have spent more time off the continent, right? So because of that, yeah, you do got some tribes that will say, I'm not going to teach my spirituality to some of those younger tribes. And you have other tribes who they wouldn't say that they're not going to teach it, but they would say what has happened. And this is where modern spiritual systems come in now, not religions, but the regular spiritual systems, where they would say, okay, if you look at a system like Kabbalah, even the systems that the Kemites or the Egyptians were practicing, you're looking at basically African spirituality written down. That's all you're looking at basically. When you talk about Kemetic information, right? When it's repackaged as the Metaneta, right? The sacred words of God, or however you want to translate that, and then you go into Kabbalah, all on both angles. And Christianity falls in the same thing as well. You're looking at spiritual systems as basically African spiritual systems written down and repackaged for our experience in the modern world. And this is as a globe, right, in the modern world. So you got other tribes that would say, actually, you can use those systems. In fact, you probably should use those systems before you use the African spiritual systems. And what I mean by that is, because if you're taking the raw African spiritual systems, because a lot of the counterparts that you're seeing now is, especially in Americas, you're dealing with versions of those spiritual systems that's a reaction to slavery, right? To the experience of what happened for 400 years. So those systems, in my opinion, were more important for preserving the culture in those regions that the slaves were in, right? And they did a good job at that, actually. They preserved the culture. So when you go to the Caribbean, when you go to certain parts of South America, you see African culture still living. In fact, sometimes you see aspects of African culture that doesn't exist in Africa anymore, right? Now, they did a good job with that. But the one thing that happens is that when you become reactive spiritually, it sometimes hurts your spiritual system. A spiritual system is supposed to evolve, and it's supposed to react to changes in the environment, and that's supposed to react to changes in the human mindset, especially changes in the human mindset of human minds that were not guided by spiritual principles. So meaning, if your human mind is guided by materialism, that type of mind, you don't want that anchoring the path of your spiritual systems. Unfortunately, that's what's happened in Americas. So because of that, we get into arguments that we're not supposed to, right? And I first understood this when I once had a gentleman who came to me and was like, he was talking about voodoo. He was talking about Haitian voodoo versus voodoo from Benin, and he was saying how voodoo from Benin is so much better because Haitian voodoo is doing things like mixing it with Freemasonry, mixing it. Basically, he was talking about Freemasonry, right? So he was just harping on the fact that it was being mixed with non-African spiritual systems, and I could tell at the time, and I didn't tell him anything because I always say it's better to let some people find out things on their own. But when this gentleman was telling me this, I was looking at him and I was like, you have a lot to learn because you don't realize that actually Haitian voodoo is very powerful, very unique, and very different than voodoo in Africa. And not saying that voodoo in Benin and Togo is not powerful either. Obviously it is, but Haitian voodoo is very different because it's more aggressive. You know what that aggression, and because of that aggression, they were able to free themselves from their oppression. And you know where that aggression comes from? That aggression most of the time doesn't even come only from the spirits that are coming from Benin and Togo. A lot of that stuff is coming from the spirits that the Tainos, the people that was in Haiti originally, that they were dealing with, right? A lot of the Caribbean and even North America, like going to Mexico and South American spirits, like spirits on this side of the world, tend to be very aggressive, tend to be much hotter. The spirits in Africa tend to be colder. Again, when I say hot and cold, I'm just talking in terms of the reaction time. So because they tend to be hotter, they react quicker. When they react quicker, you can use them to liberate yourself quicker. Now, the drawback that comes from that is you're dealing with such intense energies that if you're not careful, then all of a sudden you could destroy your nation, right? You could, and when I say destroy your nation, African spirituality is so old that it's not really set up. Like if you start to use it for things that's outside of preserving your culture and outside of basically learning to use it to integrate with your environment. So you're basically using it to integrate with your environment, using it to basically like kind of even talk to your ancestors on the other side. When you're not using it for those things and you start to use it for everyday for other things in life, like progression of a nation, right? Like, and again, I'm talking about from the modern world, because the thing is like even when people say, well, the places that practice African spiritual systems, they poor, and people who say that are not even they're not even using history or present politics, right? Economics, like and the economic hitman, like that they're poor by design. It's not really the spiritual system's fault per se, but there is some truth to the fact that those spiritual systems are not set up for the modern world. So when you talk about things for the modern world, right? Like, I want to manifest some money. I want to, modern stuff. They may not be the best at that because they weren't set up for that. They're older. So if you go and say, like voodoo, and they say, well, you don't realize that, no, in Benin and Togo, you're talking about basically just the Rada spirits. You're talking about one nation, where Haitian Vodou is talking about 21 different nations under one banner. So Haitian Vodou is even pulling on spirits that some have origins in Madagascar, have origins, you know, in like Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mali, right? Where Haitian Vodou, I mean, where Voodoo from Benin and Togo is mainly talk about Benin and Togo. So you talk about, and then that's not obviously including the Taino spirits from here, spirits from Congo, right? So you talk about 21 different nations. That's a totally different, and then Freemasons is just one of them. That's a totally different ball game. But when that individual came to me, he was coming from the reactive American mind, and he's looking at it, and because of his pain, and he should have pain. Like slavery has affected every person of color, African person in America, right? But when it comes to spirituality, sometimes you have to know how to separate the two, because this physical existence and spiritual existence can obviously be connected, but sometimes they're different. And he didn't at that time. I mean, I haven't spoken to him in like 6 years, but at that time he did not understand that, or hopefully he did now. And then that's when I started to say, you know what? It's probably time to, if I have the time, why not talk about things from the African traditional religions mindset, because it's vastly different, right? So, while non-Africans will debate about Atlantis and Lemuria, we was like, oh yeah, Atlantis and Lemuria existed, great empires, those are our brothers and sisters. But guess what? They faded, we're still here, right? So that's not gonna be coffee room talk for us. We would just be like, okay, yeah, that happened. But guess what? Because of that, then the world should understand that we have something to offer. But then there's a flip side to that as well, because those type of spiritual systems are so old. And I'm basically saying that African spiritual systems, really, if you really pay attention to what I'm saying, started before even modern humans started. Right? So even when they give a date to voodoo, and they say, 10, 15,000 years, they're just giving a date to when it became associated with certain names. Right? And which are actually the more, and not just for voodoo, but just in general. Sangoma, right? Pygmy spirituality, definitely. Santa spirituality, definitely. Like, when it became associated with certain names, right? When you look at history, you say, okay, this is voodoo. Oh, the doggone practice this. Okay, this is what they do in Mali, right? But it's far beyond that. Because if I go into Nubia and Egypt, and especially in Nubia, and they start talking about the Nubians are the foundation of Kemetic culture, right? Yeah, but the Nubians were practicing, they were practicing the Zar spiritual system, or calling on Zar spirits, right? Which are like related to the spirits of the jinns that the people in the Middle East are calling on before they even invented the Kemetic spiritual system. That really came in when writing started to come in. So African spiritual systems, it's even hard for people who are black, who are historians, to really pinpoint, because it's a lot older than people are saying. It's just that it's a flexible, constantly evolving and shifting system, because it's not written. And when something is not written down, it's like in some tribes used to say, when you write something down, it becomes stone. So they pass on things orally, because it becomes a system that has no form. So when something has no form, it's a lot harder to quantify and measure, basically. And in that sense, what ends up happening is that we have to be able to. If you're just using it to brag, if you're just using it to say, "Oh, this we're older, so we're better," you're missing the point that they are. Like, there's no question. If somebody comes to me right now, I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, if you say I want to practice African spirituality, I'll give you some books. But if you come in and you saying you want to be directed by me, I say you gotta learn Kabbalah first. Why? Because African spiritual system. See, while people are bragging about it being older, I understand how powerful it is, especially if you're tapping into a form that's really serious about their work and their craft. And sometimes it's so powerful and so old that when you're coming from the human mind or you come from the human construct, it could bring trouble to your life. So you need to be spiritually healed. And that's why it's a big progress. It's a big process because if you coming in practicing Kabbalah or Hermeticism, that's not addressing. Let's say you're a person of African descent. That's not addressing what's happened ancestrally to you for 500-600 years. So all those things are going to address, like let's say Kabbalah Hermeticism, is teaching you the spiritual law, right? It's teaching you spiritual law, using that psychologically to better your life. When you use that psychologically to better your life, then you come in and then when you practice your African spiritual systems, your mind is more transformed and ready and able to handle that type of energy. And then that energy wouldn't cause chaos to your life. Because remember, that energy is coming from such an old place or old time, that it looks at modern world or the modern systems as something that has to be eradicated, in a sense. Really, if we really think about it. Because that's actually why African spiritual systems is almost impossible for it to be mainstream, because it is so vastly different than the time period where it has its origin. So then that's why when you get into the concept of aliens, it's the same thing happens to aliens. When to somebody practicing African spiritual systems, they don't understand where the whole concept of aliens is coming from. Because if you say, well, you could look up in the sky, you see Mars, you see Venus, you see the moon, you see Jupiter, you see Saturn, especially on the planets that are not gas based, Venus, Mercury, the moon. Yeah, the moon will be a planet to them, even though I know scientifically it's not. What would happen is that you come from the African mind, they say, well, listen, they got a ground, you can walk on them. They got their own rocks. Rocks are spirits. That means, yeah, there's Martian rocks, Venus rocks. That's not terrestrial. It's not from this terrosphere or terrestrial space. Then guess what? They're aliens. That's it. It's nothing big. It's nothing flashy. Right? There's nothing that you have to be talking about ancient aliens and making up a whole bunch of different craziness. It's just basic. But when you are coming from the material mindset, you not only have to go out of your way and mess up an ancient concept that everyone knew, but then you have to put your own spin on it, which ends up being more of a hindrance than something that actually helps your spiritual journey. And that's where that's why, again, when you got people who are trying to relearn African spiritual systems, but they come from a reactive standpoint, they will just shit on the alien people, say that doesn't exist. When you're coming from the true African traditional systems, they say, yeah, it exists, but first off, the stuff that they're describing as aliens would probably be spirits, because that's what it really is, astral spirits that definitely you don't really want to be invoking in your life. And that's the first thing, right? So when the people who take the modern alien concept, when they understand aliens, they're not coming from the point, they come from the point of, curiosity, and I want to know more things. I want to know things about history that are not being told to me. And then they invite these energies that are definitely, because at least with African spiritual systems or the energies or the spirits that they're dealing with, they're not evil spirits. I'll just say they're spirits that sometimes, because they're older, they may not be as compatible with the modern world. And if that doesn't mean that's supposed to use them, it means that you're probably supposed to use systems that really first deal with healing your mind first, then plugging in to those systems that are dealing with the older spirits, what a lot of African systems are, right? That's totally different than the things that people call aliens, which are just like astral constructs that are like basically viruses. Like they are going to bring, it's not even the fact that they're bringing havoc to your life, because it's one thing if you're saying, well, certain things are so old, it doesn't fit in the modern world. That happens because the modern world was constructed materially and it wasn't constructed with spirituality in mind. So that makes sense. But in any sphere, in any whether it's golden age, silver age, iron age, bronze age, whether it's your spiritual system is constructed, like whether your cultural system, sorry, is constructed with spirituality in mind, like Egypt was, or your cultural system is constructed with materialism in mind, like the modern day Western empires are. Both angles will not deal with the spirits that that people are calling aliens. So you talking about greys, reptiles, things like that, reptilians, I should say. They wouldn't deal with either one of them. So then that's why when you start to research, you know, the Kemetic information, even the Anunnaki information, which seems some people who practice ancient aliens or who are into that culture would say, "Oh, aliens invented it." When you really pay attention, especially if you look at it from learning to read those same texts from the Kemetic mind, read those same texts from the Mesopotamian mind, right? You start to say, "Oh, they weren't really talking about aliens." You start to see that very quickly if you talk about physical beings, right? No, they weren't talking about that. So because they weren't talking about that, then they start to look at the people who are more what people call New Age, and they start looking at them sideways because they say you guys are misinterpreting what they're saying. But that comes in because the New Agers did not try to get the mindset of the people that they're taken from. But remember, look what I said: Egypt, Mesopotamia. They would still take things, or they would still take from tribes or civilizations that are still more in the middle, where you can kind of, because remember, the Egyptians and the Sumerian stuff is written down, right? So when something's written down, even if you don't understand the mindset, you could think you know what you're interpreting. When something's passed on orally, you can't take from that. You need someone from that system to plug it in, right? So if certain anthropologists go to the Dogon tribe, Dogon people, and say, "Oh, give us that information," only when somebody from that tribe agrees to it will they give the information. And even then, sometimes you could be getting information from a person from the tribe. That doesn't mean they're a spiritual that doesn't mean they're a spiritual healer or a spiritual priest or priestess from that tribe. Because it's not just, anyone could say they're Yoruba and Dogon, and they could be Yoruba and Dogon. That doesn't mean you have the authority to be talking about spirituality, though. That's the difference. And from that angle, that is where a lot of times when you do the alien stuff, that people miss. They miss the standpoint that the aliens, when you come from the African traditional mindset, it's just more, spirits that you don't want to invoke under any circumstances. That's not even circumstances that you could say, well, the world's not modern anymore. We're back to the forest living, right? Because that's one thing people don't realize. And a lot of, especially in the more Bantu tribal spiritual systems, or the Congo region and the Angolan region as well, really, your spirituality should adapt to the region that you're in. So if you're in the forest, it's older spirits. That's going to be totally different than if you're in the city. If you're in the city, certain spirits that you see in the forest never come in. So aliens, for most people who are practicing African spiritual systems, are labeled as spirits you shouldn't invoke under any circumstances because they're alien to this environment. Or that's what it is. They don't look at them as physical beings. They look at them as spirits that are so different than us. When you invoke them, you cause chaos. And that's not the same as, older spirits that you invoke that cause chaos, because it's not those older spirits' fault. It's the modern society that's built on materialism. But the difference is, even in Egypt, which people love so much, right? They won't invoke those spirits that people are claiming to be aliens. That's the difference. Whereas if I'm dealing with nature and I say, well, Africa is just old Atlantis and Lemuria, maybe even older, and our world's not built for that, then I have to be cautious when I invoke certain spirits. Then that makes sense. But no, the alien, what you call aliens, people who practice African traditional religions, no, you shouldn't invoke that in any circumstance. That's the difference, right? So when you deal with Atlantis, Lemuria, aliens, when you're coming from the non-African mind, it's going to be a totally different aspect or angle than when you come from the African mind. So I hope you like this video, and I'm going to try to do more things based on that, like regular examples, but how would somebody from the traditional African standpoint look at those things? Hope that helps. Till next time, peace.